Hi everyone, morning. I'm just going to pin the conversation. Okay, I'm gonna find Mikaela Loach, who's coming on to, here we go.
Hey, oh, that was
Hi!
so easy.
That was good. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you doing today?
I'm very good. I'm pleased to be talking with you.
Yeah, me too.
I just want to introduce everyone. Thanks for joining as people roll through. This is a conversation with Mikaela Loach on climate justice and climate migration, two huge topics, which I look forward to scratching the surface of and hopefully inspiring people to kind of further their own research into. But yeah, I'd love to hear if you could just introduce yourself and sort of what's keeping you engaged these days too, just beyond like, I guess, your career day to day, just you as a person.
Yeah. So hi everyone. I am Mikaela Loach. I'm a climate justice and anti-racism activist based in Edinburgh. So I'm currently in very cold and dark Edinburgh, where the sun set already a long time ago. I'm also a medical student. So I'm in my fourth year. So I'm currently on clinical placement in the midst of this pandemic, which is a whole thing. And I'm the co-host of the Act podcast, which I have on my Zoom background always, just so I don't forget to mention it. And it's a podcast all about climate justice and anti-racism and anti-oppression, and how do we link all these things together? How do we make sure that our movements are accessible and inclusive as well? And so it's kind of all about that stuff, and we try and make sure that we make it inclusive and accessible. And then I guess what is engaging myself at the moment? I think personally, reading is something that I've been doing a lot recently, which I've been really loving, and not just reading big climate books or big anti-racism books, also reading lots of fiction and fantasy books that just really let my mind completely escape and kind of go into this whole different world. I definitely think that during this kind of pandemic time, having some sort of escapism is really useful, and it's like a good way that we can kind of still keep some sort of normality, or at least escape into a different world. And I found that's been something that I really loved. And then even I do also read a lot of anti-racism books and climate justice books, and that's been really useful in almost I find it's really weird to explain, but calming me down to remind myself that all of these issues that exist now, they've existed for a long time, and people have fought them for a long time, and they've carried on going. So that means that there is hope there somewhere, and we can carry on going in some way. That's what I find really inspiring about older activists, activists who've been doing this for 50 years or 60 years or something. I'm if they can carry on going when they're in their old age and they still have hope and they still care, then I can carry on going as someone who's 22 and is very young to all of this in comparison.
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel like when you realize that we're part of, whilst we're still significant in this huge, large change in story, it's nice to kind of bring yourself back down. I think often when you read other people's kind of approach and their long, fight for justice, whether that's just climate justice, which obviously is not a new, whilst the climate crisis, I think, has become such a key topic and a known topic, it's not new. And I think it's always important to recognize where you begin on your journey in the scheme of the journey that's been going on for a long time.
Yeah.
And I love
and then I think sorry, carry on.
No, I was just saying that I love that you just the reminder to read fiction, because I so agree. I think as well, it just helps you to have creativity too, to often these things that we keep maybe trying the same attempts at change. And I think when you read fiction and you see someone's creativity and just different kind of storylines, you maybe sometimes can redesign your own storyline a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. I think that something I've been reflecting on a lot, I read this really great article in Vice, which was about sleep and rest as resistance, especially for the Black community. And one thing it focused on was the ability to imagine, and the ability to imagine futures, and to kind of explore within your brain, or this kind of creative side of stuff. And I didn't think I'd reflected on how much I loved reading as a child, especially. Like, I would read so much, and how much I think that was allowing myself the space to kind of imagine a different world and a different future. And I think that's why creativity is such an important part of any kind of work that we do, because it gives our brain the space to be like, how can I challenge this a bit more, and like, how can I create a solution in a different way? And that's why I do really, I'm really trying to encourage people to like read. You don't have to read a serious book. You can read a book that is like a bit pants and a bit silly, but like it'll just let your brain kind of use that part of your brain that you might not be using in other spaces, but is super important and like essential as well.
Yeah, I love that for sure. And a topic we're going to talk about, which is climate migration, is actually a topic of mine that I, a few years ago, wrote a script about this kind of future imagined world that's sort of all about essentially climate justice and climate migration and this complete new world that we imagine. And I feel like a lot of the research I did into that at the time, which was kind of before the climate work I was doing, was some of the big reasons of realizing like that's what related me back to the climate, was this idea of the uninhabitable kind of world and how that moved people around. So before I go into that, I'd love to also just hear about like what brought you to be where you are today, whether that's your activism, whether that's your studies as a medic. Like, was there a specific kind of circumstance you experienced, an event or an issue? I'm always interested to like what people were called that.
Yeah, also I'm so interested to read that script. That sounds amazing. I'm so interested. Yeah, so I think it's definitely interesting why people get into this work, especially because we all come from different perspectives, and that's why I think having as many people kind of caring about these issues and talking about them is so important, because someone will be able to relate to everyone's story in some way, or to someone else's story more than someone else's. I think for me, like growing up, I grew up in Surrey in the UK, but in like a very, very like predominantly white area. We were pretty much the only like black family around, and I think I was aware of like my otherness and of racism from like a very, very young age. And then I was like taught about all these different amazing civil rights activists and how they kind of fought for like my own liberty and all these different. Also, I was born in Jamaica, which is obviously a country which has, in how we see it today, has been founded upon like a history of oppression and the transatlantic slave trade. So I was very aware of all this stuff kind of growing up and of oppression being a thing. But at least at school, you're kind of taught like, oh, well, you know, oppression was fought and won, and we should be grateful that it's no longer a thing. Like, woo, thanks everyone else, but with all the fighting's done, like we're all free. And I kind of knew that wasn't true, but like, and I was like, I feel like there's definitely so much more work that needs to be done. And through kind of that lens, I think existing as like a marginalized person in that space, I was almost forced to educate myself more about kind of issues of oppression and be more aware of them, and wanted to do something about that. And then as I grew up, I like would read more and care more about this stuff, and got involved with migrant rights initially, so like refugee rights specifically, because if people don't know, on the border of the UK and France, there's a place called Calais, and Calais is like it's on the French side of the border, but it's somewhere where a lot of people who are trying to enter the UK will end up kind of being stuck there, and there are camps there that have kind of been formed by the fact that there are no safe and legal routes of like transport to get to the UK if you're looking to claim asylum. And I had seen when the jungle was on the news quite a few years ago, so the jungle was what they named the kind of camp in Calais. I was like, oh, this is something that I really have cared about. I've cared about migrant rights for a long time. I'd like to be able to do some kind of advocacy work around that. And so I got involved with kind of refugee rights through that sphere of like seeing something on the news and caring about it, and having been involved in other places. And I went to Calais, and it was there that I met kind of like real life activists, if that makes sense. Like, they were just people who were just normal people who really cared about something so much, and they didn't wait for big organizations or big governments to get involved. They just did something themselves, and it was super inspiring. And I think like meeting these people who were so normal and weren't like these exceptional obviously they were incredible people, but they weren't these like perfect exceptional individuals that I have been taught were the only people that could be activists. I think meeting them, I was like, okay, well, like if they can do this and they don't have to wait for big organizations, then I can kind of do some stuff too, and I don't have to wait for those other things to come through. And so I kind of like stuck on with doing migrant rights work and really cared about that. And then at the same time, I was becoming more aware of the climate crisis and of climate related things. And I've made all those lifestyle changes that we're told to do. I went vegan and zero waste and boycotted fast fashion, did all these things. But then I was like, I don't remember the exact day it happened, but one day I realized that we can't wait for everyone to make all these like small changes in order for us to save the planet. Like that won't be quick enough. And so we're going to have to do something more dramatic than that. And we're going to have to actually act and do activism and organize together. And then I think around the same time, I realized like, whoa, I care about migrant rights and I care about racial injustice and the climate crisis, and all of these things are interlinked. And through a lens of justice, we can also help these other things. Like if we take a lens of climate justice to the climate crisis, we can also help dismantle white supremacy. If we take a lens of climate justice to the climate crisis, we can also help create like a borderless world, or a world without restrictions to movement, and a world in which people feel safe, and a world that can also how the climate crisis precipitates so much conflict, which actually ends up with people being displaced. I just realized like, oh my gosh, all of these things are connected. And if we take this lens, and if I do climate justice work, then that's kind of how we can do. And then through that, I got involved with different climate justice organizations, and organizing and activism and direct action, and camping in the streets of London, and chaining myself to stuff and doing all that kind of work. And then meanwhile, just talking about all of that online, and realizing where there were gaps that weren't really being addressed in communication. And that's why we started the Yikes podcast, to try and kind of fill those gaps and communicate a lot of things that people might not understand in organizing, because there's quite almost like a big gap between people who are in organizing and who know what's going on with the movement, and then like people outside of the movement who kind of, it's like all the smoke and mirrors of how change happens. And so we kind of wanted to communicate how change happens and get more people in, and hopefully just get more people involved in the movement. So was a lot of speaking.
That's great. I mean, I think the way you articulated, the intersection of all those issues, and realizing that so many things can be simultaneously sort of, lifted, solved, there's so much freedom that can be kind of given, I think, through all these issues that all interrelate. And you realize how much stems back from these kind of systems that were often, colonial built sort of systems, ways of being or ways of viewing people, resources. That is where it kind of all stems from, I think. And like seeing the earth and people not as a resource to be kind of oppressed, extracted, all these different things. I think it's an amazing, I think that's what I've also found in this last year now, I guess, just that kind of stillness to have, and realization of the interconnectedness of things. I think that's what, I think in the most basic way, whilst how sad the pandemic has been and how heartbreaking it's been, I think just that instant connection to realizing what I do affects other people. So staying safe makes others be safe. And I think safety is obviously a huge part of all these things, feeling unsafe of the future of climate, or kind of being threatened because of your race, or kind of treated differently. And I think it's been an interesting look at safety, I think, and like how we're just all very, very connected. And I'd love to launch into our first topic of climate justice, and just to, I guess, just for everyone to break down what the principles of that is, and why it's important to put those two words, I think, together, justice, and how, I guess, how so much of that is deeply woven, as we were just saying, into also systems of oppression, and how the two relate, and why those two words together and why they're important.
Yeah, I think that there might be a bit of a misunderstanding of what climate justice means within people generally. I think people think that climate justice just means the same as any sort of climate activism. But climate justice as a principle, it's a way of seeing the climate crisis through a social justice lens. So it inherently sees that all of these different issues are interconnected. It sees that we can't see the climate crisis on its own as an issue. Audre Lorde says that we can't have a single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives. And that's kind of what climate justice sees. It sees that we can't just tackle emissions without looking at the way in which we could be doing that could also further oppress people, or the way in which emissions are produced is unequal depending on different countries. It kind of takes this like anti-oppressive lens to the climate crisis as a whole. And that's important because when we look at the climate crisis, not only is the impact of it disproportionate on different marginalised groups, so for example, the BIPOC community, the Black, Indigenous, the communities of Black people, Indigenous people, and other communities of colour, they're disproportionately impacted by the negative effects of the climate crisis. However, these groups of people have contributed the least to the creation of this crisis. So it's not only in the impacts of it that we need to think about oppression, but it's also, as you were saying before, like the roots of this crisis and how it was created and how we've even been able to get to this point is so inherently connected to white supremacy and colonialism and all of these other issues that you literally can't really divorce these issues from each other. And if we try and tackle the climate crisis, especially as we live in a world which is founded upon white supremacy and colonialism and all of these other issues, if we try and tackle the climate crisis without awareness of these issues, we will just be upholding these same issues and upholding this current world. And what we should want to do, and what I think is so hopeful about climate justice, is that we can not only kind of prevent climate collapse, but we can also make a better world for all people and a better world that's better for all of us. And I just think that's really wonderful and exciting. And from like a health perspective, so yeah, I'm a medic, so I really care about health. But the Lancet report on climate change and health, they even said in 2015 in their report, I think it was, they said that the climate crisis is the greatest global health opportunity, because if we try and tackle this crisis through a climate justice lens, through a lens that sees these different oppressive systems and how solutions to the climate crisis could also tackle these systems, we can actually improve health for all people. And so actually an opportunity for kind of decreasing all of these different oppressive systems and kind of tackling them, which I think is just really exciting. And that's why I think climate justice really excites me and makes me really hopeful, because it's like, oh wow, we can actually help all of these things like all at once, because there are so many co-benefits.
Yeah, that's a brilliant way to like you say, define what it is, because I think often it can, climate justice, be undefined or kind of confused. And yeah, I love that idea of opportunity of health. And I think opportunity too, I think when we talk about like moving forward in new behaviors and new ways, I think, you know, this last year, I think, you know, it would be impossible if you were not aware of the kind of movements that have been awakened. They were very much there, but supported on a global scale, and the headlines for, you know, a seriously long time with the Black Lives Matter protests and movement that was just really ignited and I think made aware of by so many people. And I think often, I'm sure you get questions and people asking, you know, what can I do? And I think it's the same with just the climate activism of like, what can I do? And I think it's important not only for us to, I think, or what I'm trying to do is like not only just like recognize past behaviors, but also like actively try and not only just recognize and be aware that they still exist, but also create new behaviors and new ways of actions that like are like so hopeful to the point where you just like believe that there's going to be this mass connectivity and like mass oneness. I think in the set you have to kind of be like extremely hopeful, I think, too, because otherwise there needs to be like the growing pains of getting to that like idealistic place. I don't even know if this is a question, but I'm just saying it's kind of interesting when we can't just be aware and be apologetic and guilty. I guess what's the actions beyond that need to happen to otherwise.
I think this is super important, because I think sometimes, especially since the summer, I guess a lot of people have just sat in their guilt and haven't kind of that space. And it's like, I think sometimes guilt can be quite almost self-serving as well. You're still centering yourself, and when you're in this space of guilt, a lot of times you can't really actually help other people, because you're still like kind of wallowing in I've done this before and I've done these things before and that's been harmful. But I think the reality is that all of us exist in this world, in this system of white supremacy, and this system that oppresses so many different people for marginalized identities. And what we need to do is recognize that our behaviors are going to be a manifestation of this world in some way, and the only thing that we can do to prevent that is not to wallow and be like, oh my gosh, no, I'm upholding white supremacy. It's instead to be like looking at my actions all the time. How am I in these actions upholding white supremacy? Constantly like asking ourselves, this is something that I do with myself as well, like how much of my behavior is kind of just me expressing this kind of oppressive system that we live in, and then checking myself in it, but allowing myself to move forward and kind of move on and be like, okay, I'm going to try my best in the next space that I'm in to constantly call this out and constantly push myself forward. And I think that like hope is action, and hope is doing things to make you feel hopeful. At least for me, I find that I get the most hope when I'm working with other people on something and it's really exciting and it's great, or when I see other people working in community. It's when I see kind of things changing. And I think there's been too much of this like almost passive hope of like, I'm just going to sit around and wait until the hope comes, and then like then I'll start doing something. But actually like hope can be recognizing kind of how far you've come and how far you can keep going. It can be recognizing how far the movement has come and how much like further it can go. Hope is so many different things, but I think that we aren't going to find hope and we aren't going to kind of be able to progress our movement if we are kind of arrested in this state of guilt and this state of like hyper awareness of the things we've done wrong without acting on that. I just think we need to kind of like get out of that space. And I think that that's what I'd say to people is, yeah, we all exist in this system, and some of us more than others will benefit from it. And because we might benefit from these systems of oppression, we might want to uphold them even more. But please do just like challenge ourselves on that all the time, and constantly be open to being challenged, and never really thinking that like I've got it all together and I'm completely right, because then that's where you fall into the space of like not realizing how much you've become the thing that you don't want to become, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, I know we kind of jumped into all the questions later that I sent over to you, but I'm gonna jump around. Yeah, I guess, I mean, we just spoke about this, but I think what's also important, as we've kind of said, you know, in terms of changes that are made, can sometimes completely overlook how that could actually affect people. For instance, kind of putting, you know, going to mine for a certain, you know, type of material that's for, you know, electric car battery. Like, have we thought about the effects of that country, that region that's then going into the mining of that intense material? Or kind of putting in policy that maybe doesn't quite do the groundwork to make sure that everyone's going to be equally able to like keep up with that. So I think if we need to create policies that protect people and the planet, and we need to create businesses that run on a, you know, sustainable, equal model, or even just, yeah, sustainable practices, how, I guess, is that also woven into this idea of making sure we don't kind of repeat these things of the past? And is that about making sure that, you know, those in policy are representing everyone and not just kind of a certain type of people? Yeah, I don't know. I wonder if you've just had experiences too where people have kind of had the intention to do things to serve the people in the planet, but actually maybe overlook some like blinding obvious things that are just repeating the same behaviors.
Yeah, I think this is something that is very tricky and is connected to kind of like how I guess our whole world operates, of certain groups of people or certain individuals hoarding power. And that means that creating change is so much more difficult if we still have the same people who are in those positions of power, because you're kind of like relying on having to convince those people to change. That's why I do think that kind of like shaking things up is super important, and like moving, like having, and especially in whether we're looking at governments and institutions or even within organizations, like never really allowing individuals to hold too much power, and making sure that those people kind of get replaced at certain times, making sure we're not focusing just on one person's like ideals, or kind of like for them to be the decision maker. That's why I think, I don't want to romanticize it too much, but that's why I think that leaderless movements can be really great, because they're not reliant on just one person knowing everything or making decisions for things to be the best. And that's why I am really behind like having to, really have to, if you are going to have a leader of something, change that person a lot and make sure that any decision making, any things that are making decisions, that especially if it's, say that a company is making a decision on how to manufacture something in a certain region, they should have, on the people making those decisions, they should have representation of that community which they could be impacting, because we kind of only really understand things based on our experiences of them or what we can learn. and those people who live in those contexts will understand so many things that we might have never thought of. And that's why I think, yeah, we need, like, I don't think that diversity and inclusion is the solution to tackling white supremacy, but I think we need like a whole shake-up of systems as a whole. But I do think having different listening to the most amount of voices is how we're going to be able to kind of understand more things. There'll be so many things that I have no idea about because I don't have that context, and I'll only be able to learn about if I listen to someone else, or that I should definitely not be making any decisions about because I just don't have that experience.
Mm-hmm.
I think like in learning from the past, like we need to listen to people from like who've been through these issues before, but we also need to listen to people now who are being impacted. And I think that that's kind of an issue in our world generally, is that a lot of the people who are being impacted most by a lot of things aren't consulted upon like whether they want this to happen.
Yeah, and I think just listen. I mean, the power of just listening and actually also trying to have conversations with people outside of your sphere is hard, because I think all the time we are curating what we decide to engage with, whether that's who we follow, what news kind of resource we prefer to read. I think naturally, like, our lives are become narrower and narrower, and I think it's interesting to try and understand the other side too of things. I think particularly when we've obviously been through this, you know, political time of such division, like such huge, it's like, how did we get to that point? And is it because we kind of don't listen to the other, or don't know, you know, our neighbor and all those kind of things?
Yeah, and I think this is like a whole, obviously this is a whole other topic that we could talk about for like a whole hour, but like, yeah, I think listening more generally, because I guess especially when I think about this through like a climate lens of climate work, so I've been involved with a group called Climate Camp Scotland, which I'd really recommend that people check out, and they're really great. And like part of that is I'm not in the outreach group, but the outreach to like the community around. Maybe so they were focusing on Mossmoran, which is a petrochemical plant owned by Shell and ExxonMobil in Scotland. And for that, like obviously there had to be outreach to that community to be like, do you want us to do this activism there? Do you want, like, and there are people who have very like varying opinions on all of this. We have to talk to workers, obviously, to make sure that we're not going to compromise workers' rights in what we're doing. And I think that maybe in this social media age where people just see like online, a lot of people just see online activism, there's this lack of understanding of like, and this, maybe it's a lot of the culture of just being like, if someone gets something wrong, then they're completely gone forever. But actually a lot of people aren't in this online activist space. They don't know the lingo, they don't know the word, they just care about like what's kind of in their life. And if we're not listening to those people who we say that a lot of the time we say we're advocating for these people, then kind of what are we doing? Like and we can fall into a trap of harming people when we didn't mean to, especially when it comes to kind of climate crisis. And we should want a just transition. So just transition is where workers' rights are also central, because if we look in the past, like when the coal mines were shut in the UK, that put vast like communities into like abject poverty because like workers' rights weren't supported. So I think that when we're doing any of our work, we have to also listen to people who aren't in our climate space, because those people's lives are also going to be affected by whatever work we're doing. And that's why I think it's just so much more complicated than it might seem at first. And that's why I like kind of keep more open and make sure, can we actually still communicate with people, and like how much are we just ending up communicating about oppression with infographics and how we can't need to go beyond that.
Like there's other methods of action, and I think too we'll talk about a bit more organizing. I'd love to talk about that later on, but first I would love to just go to the topic of climate migration, and how already so many millions of people have been forced out of their homes where they've obviously lived for generations and generations, and because of their environments changing, or potentially businesses or governments that have come in to extract certain things that have made the environment unlivable. And I'd love to talk a bit about sort of what happened. I mean, we spoke a bit, you obviously brought up Calais and your experience there, but like what happens to people, and how will this continue to be an issue widely sort of felt, I think, by the whole world. Obviously right now it's happening to places that may seem like out of sight, out of mind to a lot of people in positions of influence and power, but this is slowly going to come closer and closer to home and knock on our own doors as the climate changes. So I guess maybe just to talk a little bit about what climate migration is, and also, I guess, what is the reality of someone's life when that happens to them?
I think I should also preface this with, I have done research about this topic, but I have not personally experienced displacement from climate migration, and I would really recommend that people like search out for perspectives of people who have and who kind of can tell the story their own way. I can just kind of say what I've learned from my research. So I did a global health policy degree where I focused on climate migration for my dissertation last year at university, but I don't want anyone to think this is my lived experience, because I don't want to be like taking up space where I shouldn't be. But so climate migration is basically people being forced out of their homes or their environments, so where they've lived, due to impacts of the climate crisis. An example of this is, so I wrote my dissertation about Kiribati, which is a nation in the South Pacific, and you might not have heard of it. I guess the closest country you might have heard of is New Zealand, that's kind of near, but still very far away. It's a collection of like small islands that are very low lying, and it's set to be the first nation to be fully submerged by rising sea levels within the next coming years. At the moment, already the population of this island nation, or these island nations, are concentrated now on like the biggest island called Tarawa, which is the highest island of the kind of atolls, and with the other islands kind of being submerged over the last few years, that's also contaminated water. It's impacted in so many ways, but it's also meant that the population that was spread over such a kind of like bigger expanse of land is now concentrated in one area. And that's because of rising sea levels. I think that people think rising sea levels is something that's going to happen in like 20 years or in 10 years or in just an amount of time in the future, but it's happening now. People have been displaced from their homes already because of it. And like whole islands have been submerged, which I think is quite terrifying. And the fact that this whole nation is now having to have this whole relocation plan of trying to relocate an entire nation of people to somewhere that's higher, that's like higher above sea level. And that's scary. I can't even, if people can like picture wherever you are now, imagine that your like whole home is gone, you could never go back to it. That like where you used to kind of maybe farm your food, you can, that suddenly the soil is contaminated with seawater, and then one day you have to completely leave. It is completely heart-wrenching to think that you could never go back, or that you're forced to move. And whilst the kind of the issue or the case study of Kiribati is kind of one aspect of climate migration, it's also happening in other countries, and not just lower lying countries. So there's a lot of kind of displacement within countries that happens, and this is what kind of complicates it, is, and that's more related to droughts and like adverse weather effects, like maybe kind of when there's a natural disaster, that kind of thing that can be precipitated by the climate crisis. That can mean people lose their homes as well. Droughts can mean that people have no food or no way to kind of create food, that they have to leave their homes to go elsewhere. And I think as people, we care, our home is more than just like a building. It's like our community, the people that we know around us. Like maybe it's land that your family have been on for generations, and that especially in a lot of other countries where it's like quite a sacred thing to kind of have grown up in this area. The fact that people, and these are like all of them are like Black Indigenous people or Indigenous people from different nations who have been displaced from their land. It is just like a really kind of heart-wrenching thing. It's not even just from adverse weather effects as well. So I think when people think of refugees and migrants, or people who've been forcibly displaced, they think of like conflict and war. But conflict and war is also, I think I mentioned it before, really connected to food insecurity and just insecurity in a place kind of generally. And that is called like, this might get a bit technical, but that's when it's climate change mixed with war. That's like a nexus dynamic is kind of what they call it. And that shows that, and I think with all of this, if anyone's like, I'm getting a bit confused, this is why climate migration is quite a tricky topic, and why there's not as much literature around it or studies around it. And that's why these individuals currently aren't protected at all. So already for kind of like other people who've been displaced for other reasons, there already aren't that many protections for migrants and refugees. So in Calais, where I've mentioned before, where I'd been volunteering, I'd meet people who would tell me stories that like are unimaginable of the things that they've been through to get to that point, and then they still wouldn't be able to claim asylum in the same country as maybe their parents are in or their families are in. There are so many barriers that are put in the way, and all of these barriers that are being put in the way are like based upon really xenophobic and horrible policies that are implemented by governments. And this just means that people aren't really able to claim their human rights. And that's already hard for people who currently fit in the definition of refugee and migrant. And a lot of people who are displaced by the climate crisis do not fit into this definition of refugee and therefore aren't given the international protections. And I think that's what is really tricky, because it's like, if we can't protect the people who are already included, like how are we going to be able to protect these other people as well?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, like you say, it's a hugely dense topic. And I think what's really hard too, which is so the issue of climate, is you can't trace it specifically back to a certain government that has affected this one town, and therefore be able to trace the accountability of like who's to blame and who should then house and take in these people. I think it's really hard, because people, I think, constantly will shift blame, will shift people onto other places, other countries, and those obviously rules and regulations are fluctuating and changing all the time. So for anyone as an individual in that situation to understand like where is safest to go is hard. And I think what you said too is really important, is, you know, a home is not just a house, but it's all of the, you know, the traditions of your culture that are going to be specific to that climate. So I think, you know, if you are if you have a specific trade too that's very specific to your land, like how do you then practice what you were doing when you get somewhere else, when most of the time all you're doing is obviously just trying to survive, but you lose those kind of skills that are people's identities and they're people's stories. And yeah, I think it's such a sad topic that I feel like is not spoken about enough, or often, like you say, confused with refugees only becoming displaced because of you know, unrest, war, different things like that. I think it's a really important topic.
Yeah, I think that's why it's also difficult, because so in my research, like I saw the different arguments that different nations will make of why they don't need to take in climate refugees, or why they don't think there should be a term climate refugee, etc., etc. And it is tricky, because I even saw one document that was basically saying that this country, which is a high emitting country, said that under the logic of how refugee kind of protections work at the moment, is that you should be moving away from whoever's persecuting you or whoever's oppressing you. But their argument was that because they as a country have emitted a lot to create this climate crisis, people should not be claiming asylum in that country as they're going to where created the harm, which is just an absolutely bizarre argument to make. And it just shows that like a lot of nations, especially the most like industrialized nations, will kind of jump through so many hoops to try and not have to protect people, even though they are literally admitting that they've created this crisis, or they've had a huge part to play in creating this crisis. That's why I think as individuals, as people watching this, like get involved with this as an issue. Talk to your elected representatives about migrant rights, because especially when you start protecting people, then all of us get protected. I always think about, like, if we start looking after the person who's most oppressed in society, then the rest of us are also protected. Like if someone who is displaced from their like birth country, or if they're a migrant or a refugee, if they can have a safe home, then all of us will have a safe home as well. I just think that we just should be protecting each other, and we should be part of this like global community. I know we'll talk about this later, but I just think it's really sad how much we've othered people, as if like these people, I don't see them directly in front of me, and therefore I don't have to do anything about these people.
And the assumption that it wouldn't happen to you. I think that's what's so difficult to, even when you look at, you know, planet Earth, the natural world, like the time that we have lived through that has made us believe we are separate to nature, and we go to nature like it's a thing and a place, without realizing, like, we literally have to look no further than our own skin and body to realize that we are part of the same thing, and the interrelatedness of all those things. And I just think that, like, whether we're going to be forced to realize our interconnectedness and realizing we're one people, we're one humanity, just by events that will happen, which I feel like, as I was saying, kind of feel like there's been tiny parts of that through this pandemic, of realizing like there are going to be things that happen to the global kind of collective that make people realize like we're not all so separate in our countries and governments, and like certain things don't know borders, like a disease doesn't stop at a border. So I think it's interesting. And yeah, it'd be good to just talk about, I guess I'm sure as people listen, they think like, what can I do? And how can I sort of not only do, as we're saying, not everything has to exist online. There are so many things to be doing offline that can be in a sort of a scale that fits you as a person. There's so many roles, obviously, within social change, and it doesn't need to say, you know, often we see all those roles maybe online. And I think, you know, as you said at the beginning, to just see there are so many different people that come to be where they are from all different backgrounds. So I'd love just if you could share a little bit about sort of what could I help people realize where they could become an organizer, or even not an organizer, but just take part in an organization that already exists.
Yeah, I think people organizing together in community is how we've created kind of any advancements in social change. And I think that this all happens quietly and almost like lots of slow drips, so people don't realize it's happening. And so a lot of the things that people will be really grateful that we have today, like many freedoms, have been fought and won by people kind of coming together and doing that. It doesn't happen passively. I really hate when people say like, oh yeah, the world will just get better. It just does always. Like, it doesn't just passively get better. Like, people have to act and do something. And I think maybe people, if you're wondering like, what is organizing? What is organizing? What does that mean? It's literally just like people coming together, whether they're making a concerted campaign that has a direct goal, or whether they're just wanting to look after a certain group of people in their community, or whether it's like focusing on a certain topic and doing education stuff. There can be so many different prongs, but it's just kind of working together to find a more efficient way of creating change. Because when we do things on our own, like we'll do everything we want to do, but we won't be representing a whole community, and we also won't be making the most change. When we do things together, we can do so much more. And so like organizing is kind of what has prevented loads of, so if we look at, I guess a good example of organizing, obviously the civil rights movement in the 1960s in the US, that was the result of a lot of, so whilst people might think that was just the result of Martin Luther King Jr. and no one else, that was actually the result of so many different individuals coming together and organizing sit-ins and organizing marches and organizing freedom rides and all of these different things. They take people who are really great speakers and orators and stuff like that, but they also take people who just have a spare couple of hours like every day to maybe print things out, or to create posters, or to like help support people emotionally who are doing this work. There are whatever kind of skills that you have, it will be useful in some way. And I think that people might not think that they can be involved in this stuff because they're like, well, I'm not an MLK Jr., I'm not an Angela Davis, I'm not a Malcolm X. But actually, I think that when we focus too much on these individuals, and the focus on these individuals has been done to make us not realize how much change we can actually create if we can just be like maybe a smaller piece in the whole kind of thing that makes up these organizing spaces. So if you're wondering like, how could I actually, as me watching, how could I get involved? You can just like search on Facebook or on Google, like, I'm really interested in climate or whatever, and you could type in your area and then climate justice, or my area and then climate, or and then loads like different keywords, and you might be able to find a Facebook group or a website of a group who's already doing stuff, which would be really great, because then you can support work that already exists rather than kind of doing the same work elsewhere. Or if you really see a gap and you're like, I don't see the work that I want to see happening, then you can start a group yourself, and you can reach out to people, whether it's reaching out to people online or people that you know, or reaching out in your community. Maybe there's a community page. I know that like where I live, in Edinburgh, there are loads of different community pages, and you could post and be like, hey, I really care about this aspect, and I'd really love to have a group where we talk about this, where we like work out what we could like do as actions around this. And when we work together and do this stuff together, that's when we can create, not only just create change, but also create change that represents people around us, because you'll have a lot of people feeding into this. And there are so many different examples of movements. Like you look at people might know of like the Fridays for Future movement, which was founded by Greta Thunberg. But there's also another exciting movement that's coming up, and it's kind of been launched recently, is the Global Majority Versus movement, which is a group of 3 young BIPOC in the UK who I think are amazing. And they are suing the UK government under the kind of premise that the UK government is compromising right to life and right to family life of individuals in the UK, but especially of heritage communities and communities of colour in the UK who have family living in countries where the climate crisis is already affecting their family's life. So, for example, like my family live in Jamaica, and there's been huge floods in Jamaica that's compromising their lives in many different ways, and therefore my right to life, my right to family life is being compromised because my family are being compromised. So that's kind of the premise of that campaign, and that's a really great campaign. So it's Global Majority Versus, if you want to check that out. But that was also started by people who just were like, we see the climate movement in the UK as being very white in lots of ways and not representative of lots of communities that we see in the UK. We want to make a movement that connects with global struggles across the world and is representative of those struggles and of those people. And so, like, maybe in listening to this, someone's like, oh, I really care about this, or I have this identity, or I have these issues, or I see that in my community no one's doing mutual aid yet, or something like that. Like, activism and organising looks so different, and it will look different for all of us, and we have different skills, and you don't have to be a great speaker, you don't have to be super confident, maybe you're just good at like finances, I don't know, and you can work out how you can do the spreadsheets for someone's organization. There are so many different things that you can do, and I think that at the moment, or at least in the last however many years, it's been like a small group of people doing a lot of work and getting burnt out. And if only more people just were like, hey, I have a couple of hours every week that I could support this area with, or hey, I can support in this way, that would kind of relieve a lot of the pressure from the kind of the small group of people that have been holding up for so long.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, there's so many different roles, as we were saying. And I think too, just to be inspired that, you know, your first kind of journey into it doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to necessarily maybe end up being the right one or people or organization you connect with. You know, there could be many tries, and there is kind of room for, you know, there's no like wrong way to do it. I think we're often thinking like the exact right way that needs to be perfect. There really isn't. That isn't even a thing. So I think just to be inspired to try, feel things out. Don't be kind of frustrated maybe if it isn't quite the right thing. And like you say, maybe it's not the right thing because the right thing doesn't exist, because you see a gap in sort of change or representation. So I hope people feel inspired by that. And I would love just to leave on a inspirational kind of thing. I would love to hear about just what we spoke a little bit about at the beginning, but sort of, what brings you hope, whether or not that's kind of, whether that is a particular person, whether that's a place, an experience, reading books, and where you find joy just as an individual. I would love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I've talked a bit about hope, but the main thing that I think I kind of come back to a lot, and the reason why I will read a lot of like activist autobiographies in my spare time will be because really, realizing that these things of that people have been fighting for these things for so long does give me like a lot of hope. And I don't want to focus too much on individuals, but someone who does give me a lot of hope is Angela Davis, because she's been doing this work for literally half a century. Like, I can't even conceptualize how long that is to have been resisting. She was in prison for a year of her life as well, in solitary confinement. Like, she's been through so much and continued to carry on doing this work and caring about this work. And if she can continue for so long, then I'm like, and through much more hardship than I've experienced, then like there must be hope somewhere. Like, she obviously sees hope, and she's been through so much. Therefore, I think I'm almost like, I see these other people and I'm like, if they can carry on doing this work and they still think that a better world is possible, and it could be like Arundhati Roy, there's a quote from her that says, another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. And I think that, like, I always in my life, I'm trying to allow myself the stillness to realize where that breath is coming in. And a lot of the time it's like, when I'm having conversations in community activism groups, I'm like, whoa, like, we all care about this. It's not just you can sometimes think a bit lonely caring about this stuff, but actually there are so many people who care. There are so many people who are acting. And when we do work together, we can do really incredible, amazing things, and we can create change. But that just takes us doing it. And so it's just remembering to not let, I don't think, yeah, it can be easy because I think you can get complacent from maybe being too hopeful. I don't know if that makes sense, but you can get complacent from thinking that other people are going to give you hope. Or you can get complacent by being just too defeatist. I think that you just need to kind of remember in all of that we're doing that we just need to act as much as we can, but also like kind of leading on to what brings you joy, like remembering that if we want to create a sustainable world, we need to have healthy humans that make it there. And part of being a healthy human is looking after yourself and taking a rest. And I think that's why maybe Angela Davis and Audre Lorde also inspire me so much as well, because they talk a lot about self-care and radical self-care and how that can happen in community and how that's so important, and how if we're going to create this better world, we need to be healthy in there. And so I think for me, like, I find joy in like boogieing in my bedroom or in my kitchen, like just putting on like a silly song and not being serious for like an amount of time every single day, just making sure there's a time where I'm just like laughing at how silly things can be and how silly I can be, and like allowing myself to like smile really big and laugh a lot and just like shake it out. I think people can find joy in their own ways, and make sure that in everything you're doing, there's still stuff that you can hold on to and that can give you joy, because that's kind of what will sustain all of us. And if we want a sustainable planet, we need to have sustainable humans as well.
Yeah, I love that. Dancing is a great release and relief for sure. And I would love, I hope everyone is inspired by this conversation, and obviously we'll kind of put Mikaela's handles into the comment, which I've done before, but as well, obviously you mentioned your podcast, Yikes podcast, that I'm sure we'll delve into more detail for people who maybe have heard some key words that they want to dive deep into. But is there any way that we can like sort of be beyond this conversation and engaging, sort of support and stand alongside the work you're doing, or is there anything that you would inspire people to kind of to do?
I think so. With if people have been confused about any words I have said in the Yikes podcast, we try and define key words. So at the start of an episode, say we're talking about white saviorism in an episode, we'll define before the episode starts what this means, so that folk don't feel like they are kind of jumping, because I think that a barrier for people can be like, whoa, I have no idea what's going on, I can't be part of this conversation because I'm confused. So we do define things, and there's a whole episode on what is climate justice, and there's episodes on lots of stuff. So I would recommend having check out. This is our beautiful logo. And basically, I think I would really recommend that people say that you're watching this and you've learned a lot from people on Instagram or learned a lot online. I can't express more how valuable it is to take your learning offline too, and to read a book or like listen to a book. I'm not saying that everyone, I know that books can be inaccessible for different reasons, but even listening to an audiobook that's written by someone who has been doing this work for so much longer, I think there's so much value. And something that we miss out on online is like older activists, because the online space is a lot of like people in their like 20s, 30s, like early 40s, and there seems to be almost like a lack of representation of any older people there. But I think in climate spaces as well, I've learned so much from the people who've been doing this work for so much longer, and that's why I think books are kind of a way in these times of coronavirus where maybe we can't organize as much and have these big conversations that we were having before, just taking that into a space where there's more nuance and these ideas are being challenged more, and it's less like just trying to get, because social media just wants you to get like a dramatic response a lot of the time, but that's not what we need to create like a sustainable movement and to learn. So that's why I would really say like reading books is super great. I just have this in front of me. Freedom is a Constant Struggle by Angela Davis talks about movements and like how do we create movements that connect each other. And I think it's really, really great. And it's really short as well. It's just a collection of speeches. So, and Audre Lorde's work is also, a lot of it is because she's a poet. It's very like, it's almost like it's speech the whole time. So it's really accessible to read and to listen to. And yeah, I just really recommend like taking it off social media a bit where you can, because social media is limited in so many ways. It's great in so many ways, but it's kind of, we need to go beyond that in spaces and move beyond like being informed to being educated. And I think that like social media informs us really well, but I don't think it dives deep. So I would just say to people, and reach out for so many different perspectives of people who experience these things. So I've talked about climate migration, but to reach out and find perspectives of people who are experiencing this, because I can't represent everyone and no one online will, and you need to kind of address and kind of get loads of different perspectives. Yeah, so that's what I'd say. Also, you can follow me on Instagram if you want.
Exactly, yes. Well, thank you. That's really, important to highlight, looking at how there's majority of young people online and how important it is to look at those before and those that are still, very much alive and well and following their, activism still. So it's important, to look at, to read books, listen to podcasts, and like yours. I know someone said the Yikes podcast is epic in the comments.
Oh.
And thank you so much. It's been really wonderful.
Thank you so much.
And feeling very buzzed and inspired for my day ahead. So thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's lovely to chat to you.
You too. Bye. I hope to see you offline one day.
Yeah, me too.
Bye.
Bye.